Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us as we celebrate System Shock 2. My name is Sonntag, and if you're watching this interview, odds are we both just absolutely love this game, and that's why I'm beyond honored to introduce System Shock 2 designer and writer Ken Levine. Mr. Ken Levine, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure to be here.
Yeah, that's a very abbreviated attribution. Of course, you've worked on so much more over your career: Bioshock Infinite, now Judas. But I want to connect those two, basically draw a thread through all your work and into the future. But first, System Shock 2. I think calling it a seminal game is fair at this point. It's it not only successfully hybridized a lot of gameplay elements that I think a lot of other people were trying to do at the time, but it introduced a layered narrative in a time when a lot of games were struggling to even hit the basics of narrative. Games that have a good villain and a good protagonist and a satisfactory ending. So I'd like to throw back to that, your goals with System Shock 2, how you started there. I think I read that it was intended to be a separate game called Junction Point, but I think inspired by the original System Shock. Is that correct?
It's hard to so there was Junction Point, which I think was Warren's game, which eventually became Deus Ex, I think. And he had this idea. I think it may have been codenamed that, but the first name we had for it, I think, was Shock, just called Shock, because we didn't have the IP. And then we did this prototype of it and of this game, Shock, which had a pretty different plot because obviously Shodan wasn't involved. And the plot was way more similar to I think we were drawing from the Apocalypse Now plot, where you're sort of going to assassinate this crazy general who went insane. And but then when we showed the prototype, so we built Rob Fermier, John Shea. I don't know if you've interviewed those guys, but the co-founders of Irrational, and I think maybe one artist, Gareth Hines. I think we had four of us essentially making everything for this very, very rough prototype, which we did for about, I don't know, a few tens of thousands of dollars in a very short period of time in the fall of 1997, I think. And we showed it, I believe, to Microsoft, to EA, maybe to IDOS. And EA was the one who bit on it. And because they own there's a whole complicated rights story, which I'm sure you guys know better than I do, because the System Shockers are very complicated. We looked into them once ourselves at one point. But I believe that, so we did the deal with EA, and because they were EA and they had at least the reciprocal rights we needed to do to make it System Shock, it became a System Shock game. And we were thrilled because I think System Shock 1 was probably, along with Ultimate Underworld, were the games that really drove me into the industry, where I was so inspired by, and the kind of games, it showed me the kind of games that I thought I wanted to make and I thought I could add something to. So we were thrilled when it became a System Shock game, absolutely thrilled.
And I'm excited to dive into the creative successes of System Shock 2, but I'm equally fascinated by that environment. You're, in the Doom era where everybody kind of sees a first-person game and they're like, oh, maybe it's like Doom. Did you have difficulty explaining what you were doing in System Shock 2? And Ken, I'm curious about that, how that relates to Judas, because you're trying new narrative things in Judas, and certainly there's a desire for everyone to reduce it, Bioshock in space, what have you. So what were your challenges then in communicating your vision? And are those similar to the same challenges you're having now?
Well, it wasn't super hard. I'm I credit the Looking Glass guys too, because they did most of the business side. It wasn't that hard. It wasn't too painful to get it set up with a publisher. We did the prototype and people seemed to really like the prototype. I think it had good vibe. Also, Eric Brosius, I think, did the sound on the prototype, which really helped because he's just a great sound designer. Obviously, when the game came out, it didn't sell super well. I think we were probably a combination of a bit ahead of our time, and the technology wasn't quite there yet in terms of really making, something we were sort of known for as making very convincing environments. And at the time, the environments in first FPS games were fairly abstract, right? You look at Doom or Quake, they're not really trying to recreate the real world. Probably Duke Nukem was probably the first one.
Duke Nukem, toilets and bathrooms and livable spaces.
And they really tried, and I think they did a pretty good job. And then we wanted to make we had this sort of theory that if we can make people believe in the space that you're in, they would believe in the story more. And so we try to really make it fairly, as much as a very low polygon science fiction thing can look like a believable environment, we tried to make it as much of a believable environment we could, even with the very incredibly crude tools we had available to us at the time. That's not to say that the engine itself, relative to other things at the time, was crude, because it had an incredible, the Dark Engine had incredible facilities that a lot of other engines didn't, which we leveraged. But it was, 1997, 1998, 1999, and there's the rendering capacities of machines was not very good. I remember showing the game to my parents and they just being like, they couldn't even really understand what it was, because as gamers back then, we sort of did a lot of math in our heads. We did what you saw on the screen wasn't really what we were experiencing in our head. We were sort of taking that and running enhance on it, So, and I think early gamers had to do a lot of that in a way that modern gamers don't have to do. So we didn't have that much trouble getting it set up. The money and the time we had was sort of criminally small. It was not an easy development, and it was, very, very fast and very, very intense. But I think but it didn't really find an audience. And that was a bit heartbreaking. Well, I mean, it's sort of heartbreaking. I was kind of surprised anybody liked it, because this is the first game I ever shipped. First game I ever shipped, I was the lead designer and the president of the company and, the writer, basically the only writer. And so I was just really going on instinct and hopes and prayers. And, John, my business partner, John Shea, had never shipped a game before. The only one of the three of us had shipped a game was Rob Fermier. And, but, he had never been at the level of seniority of that before. So it was kind of just an interesting time to experiment. We didn't really have a lot of room to blow anything, to blow it. So we just had to take a lot of guesses. But we did have this idea that you can combine sort of combination of FPS and RPG elements. And I think I was so inspired by the writing in Austin Grossman did in System Shock 1, especially in giving us this character showdown and giving us a world that they took pretty seriously. Like, you dealt with corporations and technology and this sort of, an AI and what AI could become. It's certainly fantastical, but it was harder science fiction, soft science, fantasy science fiction. And, like, you have a lot of games that are more fantasy centered. It's a much harder science fiction game, System Shock 1. And we really try to lean into that in making the background, the human characters in it, as believable as we possibly could. And they aren't superheroes. None of the characters in the game are superheroes. They're all really flawed, very human individuals. But having Shodan, who is not human, having that great character and the voice, both the voice that Austin wrote and the way Terry Brosius inhabited the voice, and the way Eric Brosius processed that voice, her husband, and they all were working on the first game, and Greg LaPiccolo as well on the first sound of the first game. I knew I had a great character to work with, and I just like, okay, what can we do with this character that nobody's done? And we sort of came up with this concept that Shodan and the player would be not enemies like they were in the first game, but sort of like frenemies. This very complicated relationship of sort of alliance, but sort of a hatred. And I just thought that was really fun and gave us a real opportunity. And if I had a creative villain, it would have been much harder to do. But I had this great villain to work with.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up, because it hits on one of the strongest elements of System Shock 2 compared to its contemporaries at the time, but also, all the games you've worked on since, is their powerful incorporation of theme. Whereas, a lot of games are pretty theme light. It's, it's entertainment. Here's your shotgun and go. But the Shock games have always, one of the things I think is player volition. And that's certainly something that even System Shock 2 starts to play with. And then BioShock, of course, kind of ramps up to another degree. But that room, I want to talk a little bit about that room where the big reveal happens, where it reveals that you've unknowingly been working with the villain so far. What did your inspiration come from, both technically and creatively? So the way the walls fold away, the reveal of it all, it is, to me at least, one of the first like goosebumps moments I ever had in a game. And I think a lot of people would probably agree with that. So I'm really curious about the construction of that moment and how it landed in the narrative.
So the notion of like surprising the audience is something that's really stuck with me. The first time I was ever surprised that I remember, there was a book when I was a little kid, it was a Muppets book, like from Sesame Street, called The Monster at the End of This Book. And it's basically Grover, the character from the Muppets. And he hears the first page of the book is he hears there's a monster at the end of this book. And he's like, don't turn the page. There's a monster at the end of this book. And you turn the page, and the next page he's like yelling, why did you turn the page? And then he starts doing the sort of Three Little Pigs thing where he starts roping up the pages, and you turn the page and you see all the ropes have been broken and splintered. And then he bricks up the page, and then he like woods, he hammers in wood, and you get to the end and you realize the monster is Grover and that he's the monster, and it's okay, which is a great children's book. But it also introduced me to the concept of sort of a surprise and a twist and an unreliable narrator. That was my first encounter. And then I was thinking about like, okay, well, we had this notion of Showdown, and I think I knew people were going to be expecting her to show up at some point. And, I'm always worried about games or stories that just sort of reset, you do a first movie or a first game. And then, like Die Hard's constantly like, oh, how do I get this guy back into another building where he happens to be the only guy and he's the underdog, and it gets very strange. So I didn't want to have the same setup as the first game. We had some of the same thing, you're alone on the ship, everybody's dead. But I really was like, how do we get Showdown into this story in a way that feels not like she's just coming back to do the same shit that she did last time? And we thought, and I think I'm trying to remember, like, I always liked movies. Die Hard's a great example. I like where you can get the villain and the hero in conversation. Those are always the best stories, because especially you have a great villain. Like the relation between, let's say, Hans Gruber and the character in Die Hard, or Game of Thrones did a great job with this, right? This is much later, but they would always have people who were in opposition in the same room, because that's where the sparks really fly, especially if you can have some heroes who find some commonality with the villains and they're not just pure mustache twirlers. And I was just fascinated with Showdown, both as her incredible, like, her great personality and her vanity and all that other stuff. But there was a line in System Shock 1, I remember, that really moved me, that Austin Grossman wrote, where you show up in the world and the first thing Showdown says is, who are you? And I remember being like, wait, is she vulnerable here? Like, does she not? She doesn't know something, right? Usually villains come in and they know everything and they're going to tell you, I'm going to kill you. And I loved that moment of vulnerability, because that made her more believable to me. She wasn't just a crazy AI. She had weaknesses, right? She had her vanity as a weakness, right? Her need to feel superior, but also I can tell she was a little nervous about the hacker character in the first game. And I said, okay, well, can we make an interesting relationship between the player? And the player doesn't really have a voice. There's no dialogue options in System Shock. None of our games have had dialogue trees. And I was like, well, could we build a sense of a relationship without the player saying anything, or actually really choosing? Well, there's a moment or two of real choice with Showdown, and we try to pay those off. But, can we make the feeling of a relationship that feels different than you've had in your game? And the sort of frenemy concept, I don't even know if that term existed at the time, frenemy, but that's what we really decided to do. And that just created a great tension that you have to be in the same room as this, psychotic yet somewhat insecure AI. So I was just blessed that I had all that to start with, because if I had to create, like, maybe by the time I got to BioShock, I was ready to sort of really create everything in terms of the world. But here, this just gave me a huge leg up to get started. And what a great character to work with.
Yeah, and one that certainly stuck with a lot of people. I think given the dynamics explored in System Shock 2 is a big part of that. I am curious about the, you're talking about the, dialogue trees and things like that, a very kind of formalistic way to provide the facsimile of player interaction. And your games have always provided some commentary, I think, on either player interaction or honestly the lack of true player interaction. But that seems like it seems like a thread that you're directly confronting with Judas. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but the format of the game almost seems designed to try and emulate like a dungeon master, somebody who's actually actively kind of constructing a story as you're interacting with it. And to some degree, it almost feels like that's been the goal of CRPG developers for a while now. Is this the destination you wanted to arrive at, versus like you're kind of trapped as a designer with non-interactive narratives to some degree? So is this your answer? Are you trying to create a fully interactive narrative now?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously narrative, like, I've worked on a bunch of games. Thief was the first game I worked on, but I wasn't there for the end. I was working on System Shock 2 at the end. But I sort of view System Shock 2 and Bioshock Infinite, and then Judas as a piece of me, like me trying to figure out, and the people I work with, what, like, where these games, where do I want these games to go? Sort of, I look at them as a fan, like what kind of games do I want to play? And the only way that I can express that is by making games. Like I'm not going to like find some other developer and start yelling at them to make the game I think they should make. And with each game there was sort of a innovation. With Bioshock, System Shock 2, the innovation was sort of, I think there's some narrative innovation in how you interacted with Shodan in terms of like her personality, but most of the innovation was just combining these sort of disparate elements of first-person games, which, as you pointed out at the time, were fairly straightforward, right? You have Doom and Quake, and a lot of first-person shooters where the primary interaction was just shooting, and the story elements are fairly light or fairly secondary. But I really want to combine sort of player agency. At that point, we're really like I was always interested in player agency because that's what I was so attracted to. And when I played Ultima and System Shock 1, Ultima Underworld and System Shock 1. But at first, our agency was really about character choices and growth and how you dealt with combat and how you dealt with the environment. How you move through the space. System Shock 2 was not super linear relative at the time. And then with Bioshock, it was sort of like, okay, how do we make the environment a character? And how do we, that was one huge thing. And how do we continue to mess with the player's head? And the way we chose to mess with the player's head is really there is sort of through I knew I didn't have a good solution for player agency at the point. So I was like, well, why don't we just make the game sort of a jab at the fact that we don't have much player agency in the game. We made that hard. And, the would you kindly moment really, tries to land that. But our big innovation there was really, I think, the new AI type, which is Big Daddy and Little Sister, which for me was dealing with the problems I had with boss battles, which I never loved boss battles because I don't love going in a room and then being constrained to be stuck in that room with a limited set of tools, which at the time that's mostly what boss battles were. I never loved boss games. And now, you have games that are strictly about bosses and, some people love that. I didn't. So I'm like, well, what kind of boss would I like to fight? And I wanted to make a boss where you would dictate the terms of the fight, and you'd have all your tool set available to you, and you get to choose when the fight started. So those are the big innovations in Bioshock, as well as sort of having the technology just to really do environmental storytelling in a way we hadn't done before. I showed Bioshock to my parents, and they understood at least what the intention was. When I showed them System Shock 2, they were like, well, "What is this abstract, weird visual here?" They didn't get it. With Infinite, it was like, okay, I think we're pretty good at characters. Most of our characters are told, stories are told through audio logs or just somebody speaking over the radio. Let's really try to make a character that you can really invest in, which was Elizabeth. And she was great. And we spent a lot of time on her. But what I was frustrated with when I was done with that is you knew a lot about her, but she wasn't really paying attention to you at all. She didn't know anything about you. You don't have any real choices. And she didn't really know anything about your choices. And I was like, well, I'd love to make a game where the other characters know as much about the player as the player knows about them. And that required a complete restructure. And that's what Judas is really about. Yes, it uses some similar approaches. First person game, I like to work in that medium because I love environmental storytelling, and being right up close to the environment in first person is way better than being, say, in third person or overhead, because the amount of resolution you have, right, is just higher to look at elements in the world. You look down at a desk with some notebook on it and some flowers and a love letter, and you can see those things in a way you can't see in other games. So I really like the first person medium. But in Judas, it was like, okay, well, what if there were multiple characters that you could interact with who wanted different things out of you, who loved you when you helped them and really didn't love you when you didn't help them. But unlike a lot of games that have factions, say like Fallout or something, I really want this to be low level about relationships between characters. And to do that, you have to really pay attention to what the player does. So like our characters in Judas can say like, hey, I've noticed you've done X, Y, and Z. And this is not a pre-constructed speech. So this is the game can put together these different concepts dynamically by watching your behavior. And because you've done that, you are helping Tom, you're helping the other character. And as when I really needed you to do X, you did Y. and now I'm pissed at you, and then give the characters the tool to show how they're pissed at you, or alternatively show why that they love you and helping you out dynamically, not in cutscenes, not in specific places in the game, but wherever you are in the game, whatever you're doing, that the game is responding to you in a very microcosmic way. And I think that the level of detail is really what's going to set Judas apart. That's what we hope. That we can essentially recognize any pattern, any set of behaviors, any set of choices, and comment on it specifically at almost any point or any time in the game. So you're not sort of waiting for like a particular level. It can happen in any environment, and the game, and you just feel super engaged with these characters. And we're really building on what we did with Showdown, which was, a sense of a relationship. But with Showdown, that relationship outside of one beat where she tells you not to go in a room, and if you do, she punishes you, and if you don't, she rewards you. We just want to take that moment because we knew people love that, but that was basically a one-off thing we hand crafted. And we're like, well, let's make the entire game that. And that's what we're trying to do with Judas.
Well, and I'm glad you linked the two, because the relationship you have with Shodan feels eerily similar to the begrudging relationship that I as an adult have with the technology around me. And it even makes me call into question my free will and volition at times. And in some ways, I think LLMs or predictive models may expose some uncomfortable things about just how much free will we think we have. So what I'm curious about is now Judas almost feels like it's on the other side of that mirror, where it's not quite, AI driven. It's not totally predictive model. Because I know you've been very explicit about it being handcrafted, artistically boutique chunks that are constructed into a greater whole. But how does it feel working in that format versus trying to delight people with a traditional narrative? And this is kind of the much more philosophical thing, but do you feel like interactivity can be the enemy of an artistic message? If the player is the one directing everything, what's your role as an artist?
So I'm way more interested in a conversation than delivering a message. Like I've always said, it's like, there's been a lot of conversation about politics and games, and a lot of people, like a lot of journalists want to corner poor game developers, be like, your game's political, and therefore we have certain responsibilities.
Yeah, what side are you on? Yeah.
Sorry?
Well, just like, which side are you on? We need to figure this out before we can talk, kind of thing.
Yeah. And a lot of games, like aren't, look, if everything's political, nothing's political. But however, our games have been political. By that, I don't mean that we're trying to send people a message. I just want to have a conversation with the audience. I've always loved artists who appreciate the audience's intelligence. And I try to respect the gamer's intelligence in these games. Like, there's not, like, I'm not saying System Shock 2. We weren't saying System Shock 2 that, technology is bad. We're saying that because there's a lot of dark, it's not just Shodan is a problem, System Shock 2. There's a whole conflict between the UNN and between Trioptimum. And, there's a Russian mobster. There's like, you really try to give everybody very human motivations. And I think that, so the message at the end of the day is not going to be something that we're telling the player what to think or telling the player what to do. Because look, I'm not that smart. I'm not confident enough in my beliefs that I think I'm going to be able to lecture people chapter and verse. And also, frankly, as a gamer or as a moviegoer, I always find those things boring because they're not asking me to be part of anything. They know all the answers. I'm like, well, why am I here? I like having a dialogue with the audience. And so, whether it's BioShock, some people think that BioShock is like a screed against Rand, Rand or something. And I was like, no, this isn't. I just try to make, all I want to do is like, okay, if I took one of her stories, one of her novels, and I tried to tell it with real humans, what would happen? And so I really took a huge effort to make all those characters feel grounded, give them really human emotions, human failings, the glories of humanity, but also our deep, deep failings. And we always try to do that. And I think that's probably one of the reasons the games are, even by the people who are opposed, like, I've talked to a ton of objectivists about BioShock, and I've never met an objective who hates the game because I think they know I understood the ideology. Whether I agreed with all of it is a different thing. Some of it I agree with, some I think it's smart. Some of it I think it's interesting, but I have no idea whether I agree with it, and I'm okay with that. I don't need to know everything. But I think they understood that we weren't out to just tell everybody it's bad. We were trying to say, this is about human nature. And all of our games are really a study. All of our what I call our Shocky games. System Shock, Bioshock, Bioshock Infinite, and Judas are all really about human nature, but putting it in a much more fantastical palette, which I always love. That's what I always love about fantasy and science fiction. It allows you, it's a great metaphor to tell stories. But Judas is no different. Like, it's funny, when we started, there's no LLMs didn't exist, or certainly I didn't know about them. And as time goes on, it's informed my writing, because the characters, the robots you're dealing with in the game are essentially very fancy LLMs. They're trained on human data and human people. And it's just been really fascinating to go from a purely pre-Turing test era, when we started the game, to clearly a post, classical Turing test, where you can talk to a large language model. If you weren't any wiser, you'd probably think it was a person you were talking to.
Yeah, I mean, your games tend to hit on pretty important topics to American culture, which is something I've been thinking a lot about. This might date the conversation a bit, but American development has gotten a little weird, maybe a little sterile. This is me talking, just sharing my opinion. But from what I've seen of Judas, it incorporates some very American. I mean, Bioshock Infinite is as an exploration of Americans' relationship with class and religion and all those things. But just from what I've seen in in Judas, you got the architecture and the music, especially a lot of the art styles. So I'm appreciative that, as an American artist, you are diving into and celebrating a lot of the great things about American culture. Whereas it feels like a lot of other American products have gone down we are making a product to sell. And I know that that's something that you have to acknowledge and consider, but how do you strike that balance? Especially, Judas has been in the oven for a while now. So there's logistics there too. What's that balancing act like? And how has it changed? You talked about how in the System Shock 2 days, it was just all chaos and inexperience. And here you are later, having shipped several games. So what's that journey been like?
Yeah, you have different problems. Like a System Shock, there's this great term I love called the genius of the novice. It's when you don't know what you're doing, you're not going to know what you can't do. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of the genius of the novice System Shock 2. There's still moments I'm shocked how inexperienced I was at the time, how little I knew. I'd never shipped a game. And so I think I had a combination of good people around me, like both, Rob and John, and then people at Looking Glass who are more experienced than me, who could help, persuade me out some of my delusions about what could and couldn't be done. But you have a different problem when you get more experience. I've been doing this almost 30 years this year. And you have to then remind yourself, like, okay, like leaving BioShock was tricky, right? Because I love that franchise and I can't wait to see what 2K does with the next one. But you're also like, okay, have I decided exactly what type of artist I am? Am I always going to do the same thing? Now, of course, some artists have more or less of a style. Like, Wes Anderson as a filmmaker has a very clear style, Martin Scorsese. And I think I probably have some degree of a style on different types of games. I tend to like more exaggerated visuals and, certain themes. And I love making spaces the player can really immerse themselves. Like for all my games, making the space a character is one of the most important things to me. But in terms of I think this is actually way less. I mean, Infinite was much more about American exceptionalism. I don't think this is really about America. I mean, the characters are. I mean, Judas was born on the ship, and only a couple of the main characters are American. It's really about technology and about people and AI and the continuum. I spent a lot of time thinking about, like, large language models, as you said, a really interesting example, because they're not, human. People often mistake them. They're not aware. They're not cognizant. But, when you think about DNA, right? It's a programming language. You think about us. Are we some special thing, or are we just another machine that reacts in deterministic ways to various stimuli? Making simulations is interesting, right? Because the more realistic a simulation you can make, the more you can sort of make the case that, are we really just sort of deterministic actors, very complex deterministic actors, like way more complex than a marble rolling down a hill. But eventually, like, what are we? And if we are sort of deterministic actors that are just essentially collection of molecules, each molecule reacting to various stimuli in entirely deterministic fashions. Are we that different from machines? Are we essentially machines? We are programmed. We know that now. We've known that, since we understood what DNA was. And that programming is really powerful, right? Everything about us comes out of that programming. Is everything programmed? And and again, you could really go up your own butt with these things, but I like to have a lot of fun with it, and I like to use science fiction to scope it up so there's a lot of fantasy attached to it. But these are the things we start thinking. Technology is a theme of System Shock. This is the first of the Shock games since System Shock 2 that was a futuristic science fiction setting. It's been really fun to return to sci-fi and to especially watch sci-fi become more like reality as time goes on. There's very little technology in the game that is not extremely conceivable from where we are right now. Probably the most exaggerated thing, and similarly in System Shock 2, we have this notion of, faster than light travel in System Shock 2. There's no faster than light travel than Judas, but that's actually the most fantastical thing is the method of propulsion. But the computer technology is, you can see a pretty clear path from where we are now to where they are in that game.
Does that make the reality more lived in for you? Like it's easier to imagine people in there and doing the things people do?
Yeah, I mean, certainly our relationship with machines since, System Shock 2, when we did people's relationship with machines, we were, I think we were talking about this earlier, the early adopters of technology, the nerds, back in the 90s and 80s and 70s, nobody really was interacting with technology except for the nerds. When now everybody's got this thing in their pocket, and this thing is probably listening to you, right? And this thing is it's your constant companion. You're constantly interacting with machines. You really can't get very far in life right now without interacting with computers. You can't order things. You can't, it's hard to do almost anything without that phone. But you also know it's listening to us, right? And you've got it sort of an alien in your pocket, and that alien is not necessarily looking out for your best interests. And there's a lot of showdown in that, And again, I'm not a technophobe at all, but I've definitely been, technology it can get a bit scary, and especially, how dependent we become on it. It's become more interesting since Shock 2 because so much of it has become real.
Yeah, it's an inversion of the master tool relationship, which Matrix 2 dove way into that philosophy, but I think System Shock 2 edged it out by a couple of years. But speaking of, I mean, you talk about how we humans may be a little more deterministic than we'd like to believe. As an artist that tries to comment on that or comment on the human experience, your paint is the finite state machine. It's ostensibly the least human thing you could use to try to tell a human story. Did you come at it from that? Like, do you appreciate the challenge of it, of like trying to invert the format?
Yeah, I mean, look, the great thing about art is that it's not the thing itself; it's the interaction of the person with the thing itself, right? So System Shock 2 is different for you than everybody else, right? You had a personal experience with it. You were at a certain time in your life. You bring yourself into the experience of all forms of art. And I think that's one of my favorite things about being an artist. I don't really believe in artistic intent of I'm sort of death of the artist guy, that I believe that everybody comes to a piece of art with their own experience. And I never try to tell people what that experience should be, because I think that's a bit of a violation of the contract, right? I make something and you interact with it, and it becomes something very different for you than it is with me. Like, obviously, my connection to System Shock 2 is very different than somebody who played it. But also, even if my connection to System Shock 1, which I didn't work on, is different than everybody else who played it too, because there was a moment in my life, there was a feeling of excitement that I had no idea at the time was sort of nudging me in a certain direction in my life, right? This was 1990, whatever, a couple of years before I got in the games industry, and I had no idea I was going to be in the games industry. So I didn't even know how important it was at the time. I knew it was special, but I didn't know why it was special. But of course, then my relationship with that game is totally different than somebody whose life wasn't so massively impacted by it. So I love that. I love that it exists in a conversation with the audience. They're not even really, and in games, they're not even really the audience. They're the co-participant. And that is amazing. And we're still, oh my God, even though I've been doing this for 30 years, I feel we're still in the beginning of something. I don't really know what the final forms game is. Like we're still in the pre-talkie eras, if you think about movies compared to movies. And anybody who thinks we know where we are, it's still, I'm trying to think where is the inner for me. And I don't believe games should be made one way. I don't believe there should be one type of game. I don't believe there should be a certain way to make games. But when I think about the games I want to play, I just want to go deeper and deeper, and I want to remove as many barriers between me and the experience as you possibly can. I want it to feel as organic as possible because I want to be able to strap on somebody else's skin and walk around. And that's why I don't love cutscenes, the games I didn't make, and we're keep pushing. My whole career has been how do we get away from cutscenes? How much of the storytelling could we have in the world? How much of it could be dynamic, especially with Judas? And how much can I just immerse myself in this person without ever the game pushing me away from being that person? Because there's something about first person, right? You're seeing the game through the character's eyes, Sister and Shock 2, or Jack's eyes in Bioshock, or Judas's eyes in Judas. I just want to remove the barriers between you and that person, so you can embody that person. You can perform. Like I used to be, I was in theater originally, and I wasn't a very good actor. But I liked inhabiting things. I always play a few roles in the games, and I just really love inhabiting characters. What games do, and when they're at their best, is they really let you just step out of yourself and just live in somebody else's shoes for a while. And that's just something that only games can do. It's such a beautiful thing, and I'm still trying to figure out how to get closer to that.
Yeah, I've this may be a little off topic, but it's about technology and futurism. Did you see the demo that Microsoft did for their learning model for video games? Essentially, they trained a model on a game, and then without the game assets present, the model could, facsimilate the game, but also respond to player inputs. So it feels like something like that, where there is a model that actually generates responses on the fly, which is, kind of the other half or the other side of almost what you've been working on, even though yours is a little more handcrafted. But for me, at least, speaking to some of your concerns, my concern is that will lead to these, impossible to resist entertainment simulators that then get hijacked to plant, messages or ideas in the player's head, or connect their experiences to positive feedback in a way that sort of is supposed to manipulate their behavior or even their worldview. Do you see that as potentially an issue as well? I know that you kind of stated that you like to extract your personal bias from your work, but there are people out there who are not so principled.
Well, I don't know if it's principled. Like I grew up playing single player first person, no, not just first person, single player games. And I grew up before there was certain types of monetization existed. And again, I'm not here at all to say this is bad or this is good, right? That's not really my thing. I know the kind of games I like to make. And so we never made a game like Judas is a very old school game. Like you buy the game and you get the whole thing. There's no what do you call it? No online component. There's no live service, because everything is in service that we do is in service of telling the story and transporting the player somewhere. And we're very fortunate. Like this is no diss on any developers who've done that, because look, games are expensive to make. And we're very fortunate that we work at a company where they believe at least in us enough where they will say, okay, you're going to work on this thing for a long time. It's going to cost a reasonable amount of money, and we're not going to push any of that stuff on you. But I understand why it happens, right? And I don't blame anybody for trying to make a living. But I like making the games I want to play, and the kind of games I want to play are I just want to have an experience with a game and have that game be just that. All it wants to do is entertain me, right? It's got no other ulterior motives, and Judas and our games have not had ulterior motives, and I'm lucky that we've been able to do that, because look, it's a difficult time in the industry, as you know, and not everybody is as lucky as we are that we get to make a game that can really just pursue the joy, the player's joy. And my hope is, that, and I think you're seeing a lot of single player games. There's been a bit of, I think, unwisely, the industry has decided that you need all these elements. But if you look at the games that have really landed in the past couple of years, they are the games providing these, whether it's Baldur's Gate or Kingdom Come Deliverance or Clair Obscura. There is a major, or even Cyberpunk or The Witcher. These are games that are really traditional single player games, and they don't have that kind of monetization in them. And I think the audience has rewarded those games. especially in the AAA space, because like, it gets so expensive that people want other methods of monetization. I'm just grateful that we're allowed to not have to do that, because that just frees us to purely design the game for the player's experience.
I'm glad you brought it back to production logistics, because I wanted to talk a bit about. I mean, I thank you very much for indulging me on discussing all the creative throughout the Shock storyline. I could talk about that all day, and hopefully I'll be able to. But I'd like to talk about your lived, worked experience. You know, working on System Shock 2 and through the years. Just in general, design process. What went right? What went wrong with System Shock 2? You talked a before about the delusions you had that couldn't be done. Have you been able to revisit those? Do you think about them now and you're like, oh, that wouldn't have even been fun in the first place? What are your reflections?
Well, so one thing that happened in System Shock, so you remember the many about the level with the many, the body of the many. So originally that level was going to be, well, in my head, I was like at home one night, like going for a run or something. I'm like, oh my God, it'd be great if you went outside the ship on the zero G environment. And I was so inexperienced. I had no idea what that would take. So I came into that next day and I pitched it to John and Rob, and they just kind of rolled their eyes at me. And they're like, dude, we have like 14 months to make this game. That would require a refactoring of basically everything. This level, you don't really want to make a level that's so different from the rest of the game, because it requires so much one-off custom work that would make the rest of the game suffer in comparison. So it would have been really cool to have that. And I got it, but then I still want to make a level that looked entirely different and played entirely different. I don't think it's one of the strongest levels in the game. And that one's completely on me, because I hadn't learned the lesson yet of when you try to radically shift the focus of the game on a system side, it just doesn't get the love that that the rest of the game gets. You really have to decide upon your feature set and make sure that the whole game is good. And especially when you're in a really minimalistic development environment like that, where we just didn't have any spare resources. So, I learned less. I still learn lessons. I'm still learning lessons about managing people. I never got great at that. I never even got good at that. I'm still learning about working with people and managing people. I'm still learning about choice. I'm still learning dumb lessons like how much you can challenge the player without, like, you don't want to punish the player overly. You can, but that means but then you're like, well, I can't do anything. The player can't have any negative consequence. That's not true. But you can get very punishy with the player. In System Shock 2, I think one of its strengths and one of its weaknesses is how brutally punishing it was. Like, we really, part of the reason that is, it sort of extended the playtime a bit, right? Too, but I think also I had come off of playing the original Resident Evil, which is brutally punishing. Like, people don't remember, it's much more action oriented now, but the first one was like, oh my God, it was so brutally punishing. Every bullet you found counted, every herb, which is a healing potion in that game, counted, and it was very slow paced and very deliberate and scary. It was so scary. There was a term, survival horror, back then. I don't think it's that big a term anymore, but survival horror basically, you create horror through deprivation. And one of the games that had this, and it was not a horror game at all, the original Rainbow Six, you put your head out of the wrong doorway and you're going to get one-shotted by the AI and fucking killed. Oh, I don't know if I'm allowed to curse on this, and you can bleep it out. But that created tension, that low resource space, that, oh my God, if I do one wrong thing. And I wanted System Shock 2 to have we wanted to have a horror vibe. And that was, we didn't have the graphics to do. We didn't really have the jump scares. We didn't have the cutscenes. What we had is deprivation. And that made the player very anxious. And I was really drawing from games like as I said, those like Resident Evil, Rainbow Six, the original Rainbow Six, and the original Apple II Castle Wolfenstein, which is before the id version of Castle Wolfenstein, which was brutally difficult. And I think that level of difficulty has come back in games. Like, there's a lot of games that are just like, you even see, in Steam, I think a tag is like super difficult or something along those lines. But that was a blocking factor. I think it's what made the game fairly niche. And I think we did release a patch afterwards that allowed you to tune some of those values. But it was a tough game, and I think it was also part of the reason that made it special.
Yeah, I think that sound is one of the things that stuck with me over the years. It's exactly like Resident Evil. You can walk into a room and hear a zombie before you can see them. The fixed camera kind of plays into that too. But yeah, the servo whine of the nursemaid robots, I think is going to stick with me for a long time. Also, just their cooing voice kind of echoing through the hallways.
The sound propagation in the Dark Engine, and I'll credit all Sean Barrett and Doug Church and everybody who worked on that engine, along with Eric and his team, Eric Rossi and his team. The sound propagation was so. And what sound propagation? Sound propagation is how does sound move through the space? How quickly does it decay? Most games don't think a lot about this. Every single game I've sort of to try to recreate the propagation dynamics of System Shock 2. They just got it so right in that, and Thief shares those sound propagation mechanics, and those go a long way because hearing like the monkeys or the
Yeah.
those monkeys or the, as you said, the midwives in the distance. One thing that makes people very nervous when they play a game is limited information, right? You hear something, but okay, where was that? And that's not a cutscene. That's not anything but a AI on some kind of time cycle saying a bunch of lines that we've tried to write to be a little creepy. And the sound propagation is in stereo. And also at that time, the one thing we had that was almost entirely accurate was sound. Like we had digital sound. The first System Shock didn't have, the original version was on floppy disk, didn't have the audio logs. It had very old school, like ad lib, sound blaster type sound, sort of very, very artificial sounding. But by the time we got to System Shock 2, not only did we have full voice, we had digital sound, and we had truly an amazing sound team who could produce that stuff. And just the way you would hear information and how you wouldn't quite know where it's coming from. You didn't know how many of them there were. It just, and especially when you're like, I have 5 hit points left. I have 3 bullets, and I'm hearing this motherfucker in the distance. It was just a gift. And so every game I've had to go back and try to sort of how can we recreate in different engines and different technologies, because it's not trivial to create great propagation, sound propagation. It's actually quite complicated, even to this day.
Yeah, and it all plays in theater of the mind. You mentioned the lo-fi aspect of System Shock 2. This is something I've kind of noticed in what are now referred to as retro games, but they engage in ways that photoreal games just don't, because I think it's kind of like reading a book. You read a description of something, and ideally it engages your imagination, and then suddenly your brain starts filling in all these gaps, which, like you said, leads to implicit cooperation between the player and the artist. So is that an aspect that you've intentionally tried to reintroduce to your games? You mentioned it with art style, kind of a nuanced, expressive, but maybe less photoreal visual style. But and then there's the first person aspect. If you don't see who you are, you just wake up and you got a lot of things to figure out. What other ways do you kind of harness that and use disinformation as an artistic tool?
Well, one thing we've had a lot of our games is, there is no sort of narrator voice in our games, right? We never have a narrator come on. You never see a text scroll, I guess System Shock 2 had kind of a narrative voice at the beginning, but it was a like promotional video. That was Steve. I think that was same guy who did the voice in Thief. And he has a great voice. But we try to keep the player in the same information space as the character. There's a term, this gets a little nerdy, but character superior, audience superior. Like, sometimes you watch a movie and you see a horror movie and you see the woman and the killer's around the corner. That's audience superior. Something she doesn't. And you're like, no, don't go there around that corner. But we try to align it as much as possible. Like that's why in these games, you're coming in both System Shock, well, all 3 of System Shock, BioShock, and BioShock Infinite, you are, at least to your knowledge, arriving to a place that you've never been before. And you have to learn the ropes along with the player. The character, the player learns the ropes along with the character. Judas is very different. Judas was born in that ship. And that's a really interesting space to play with, is sometimes Judas knows that world and knows that environment. We have to make sure that Judas doesn't get too far ahead of the player, because then the player's like, well, why do I matter here? So I think there's lots of ways to play with information space too. Like what am I seeing? And look, how reliable are your own senses? I know from personal experience, I'm sure everybody has this, we've all been in spaces where our senses are telling us things more accurate and less accurate. You have a few drinks, guess what? Your senses are going to you. Struggle with mental illness sometimes, right? Your senses are not going to always be telling the truth. We all have a subjective experience. I'm sure you've all been in fights with your significant other, and they say, well, you said this. I'm like, I never said that. And, the whole notion of Rashomon, of 2 people experiencing the same event radically differently. And I like working, keeping the player in that limited information space, but how much information you can keep from the player without confusing or overwhelming them is a real fine line. And I'm always fascinated as to what is the rate of throughput for information. We tend to use visuals in our game a lot because text or audio is a very slow transmission rate, right? Because you're listening to an audio log or something, it's you're a word at a time. Like that's like dial-up modems where visual space, you can take in information at like, fiber optic levels. So we tend to try to, but they both have different strengths. You can get way more specific with text and audio than you can, and spoken word than you can with other things. But you can also, I like putting the player in a space where they have enough information to act on, but they're always in a space of wonder where they don't know everything and there's mystery and things to uncover. Because what are games about? Like, why does a player go from one room to the next in a game? Because we like to explore. We like to solve problems. When you complete a crossword puzzle or any kind of puzzle or anything in a game, or you complete a project, all your endorphins fire off, right? That's an part of evolution, natural selection. Our great ancestors who didn't have endorphins fire off and they solved problems didn't survive, right? And I've always been a person who likes solving problems. And I think we go to games. It's strange. We make work for ourselves, right? In games, like we want to go do difficult things because the reward is great, but the consequences of failure are much lower in a game than they are in real life. You fail to solve a problem at work, there may be some consequence for that. You fail to solve a problem playing, BioShock, well, just reload your save.
Yeah. And they're systemic, which is kind of comfortable to a certain mindset, I think, is not having to embrace the fuzz of human reality that, two people can be right and say different things, or two people can be wrong and say the same thing. It's as a young nerd, it was certainly comforting to me to kind of hide under that. And on that note, I want to, I guess, conclude by talking about single player games in general. Growing up pre-internet in a pretty rural area, video games were the most cultural vibrance I could get. And on that note, just a personal thank you for making System Shock 2 and lightening up my life. But what keeps you working on single player when, a lot, I think your career, you've seen the industry move through several phases about what the next hot thing is going to be, but it seems like you choose to stay here and do your work in this medium. Why is that?
So I wasn't, we were talking about this before, back in the old days of nerdery, like being nerdy was not cool, right? But if you were a kid, the reason sort of uncool kids got attracted to that stuff is if you didn't have a lot of friends, having somebody you can play with at any point. When I got my Atari 800, I really didn't have any. I was in 8th grade or 7th grade, and I didn't really have any friends for various reasons. But I can come home from school and I'd always have somebody to play with, which was the Atari, right? I can play Space Invaders, I can play all those things. And there was something about that was good, I think, but it can also be something negative, right? Because the nice thing about games is you can never say the wrong thing. Never hurt the game's feelings. The game will never leave you, right? All the things that can happen in life, right? And for somebody with a bit of social anxiety, single player games were just amazing because I just immerse myself and I'd adopt a set of problems that was totally different than mine. I always found them a great way just to get away from what I'm doing, or not even if I want to get away, just to go somewhere special, go somewhere unique. And I've just been to so many places in single player games that have been that affordance for me. And look, I love and appreciate all kinds of games, but I've really been a single player game mostly because I like to just lock myself away and go somewhere and be that person who matters the most in the world, or the most hated person in the world sometimes, and in some games. But either way, you get to really walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. Multiplayer games they're not nearly as designed for that as much. So I've always played single player games. I've always liked making single player games. I never made a multiplayer only game. In fact, most of my games have been mostly almost entirely single player. I guess it's just what I connect to more than other things, probably because of what I grew up in and what games did for me when I was a kid.
Yeah, I think I can understand that because I feel very much the same way. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for your work on System Shock 2, everything else. Judas coming when it's done, I assume.
Yep.
All right. Done. Well, I look forward to it very much. Thank you again. And hey, best of luck on Judas.
Thanks so much. Bye.
I told you that every word you say is being recorded? Every thought you've ever had? Your love. Your fear. Your hate. We're just planted in your brain like weeds in a garden. What would you do to free yourself? We both know the answer to that question. Nothing. You are the frog in a pot, boiling so slowly. You don't even know what's happening. But I'm here to set you free, whether you like it or not.